Philippe.
Good evening and welcome. Bienvenidos, friends of the Hispanic Society, to a special installment of our program, Las Tertulias de Arte Hispano, or Hispanic Art Gatherings. Thank you once again to our members who have joined us monthly since May, and welcome to all those who are tuning in for the first time. We continue these conversations on the first Tuesday of each month at 5 p.m. And if you are not a member yet, please do consider joining by going to our website, hispanicsociety.org, and search for membership under support. Additionally, I would like to remind you all, our members, that the Hispanic Society is pleased to present the outdoor installation, Treasures on the Terrace, which is open from now until December 6th and includes photographic productions of works found in the collection. The installation includes text and audio and can also be explored online on our website. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with the Hispanic Society's acting executive director and president, Margaret McQuade. Margaret will discuss a group of objects called Bouquet of Indias, a term difficult to translate exactly into English, but after this you'll be able to. The presentation is titled Noble Taste for Búcaros de Indias. A native New Yorker, Margaret's career spans 27 years at the Hispanic Society, moving from curatorial assistant to curator, an assistant director, and currently she is the institution's acting director. Margaret has her PhD from CUNY Graduate Center and has traveled widely, both in Spain and in Latin America. She specializes in the decorative arts of Spain and the Americas with a particular focus on ceramic traditions. In addition to collaborating on several exhibitions in the US and abroad, she curated in 1999 the exhibition Calavera Poblana, shown at the Americas Society, as well as in Puebla, Mexico, and an exhibition on amphora ceramics that was shown at the Hispanic Society and in Spain at Castellón de la Plana and in Valencia. More recently, Margaret has focused her time on capital projects for the Hispanic Society and deepening the mission of the Hispanic Society for wider audiences. After Margaret's presentation, as some of you know, we will have a brief conversation, and I invite you to join us afterward by submitting your questions in the comments section. You may, of course, submit your questions and comments at any point during the discussion. So thank you for joining us. And now here is Margaret McQuade.
Terrific. Philippe, thank you so much. I just want to say it's a real privilege to be here with you once again in this strange virtual world that we live in. I'm still digesting the 27 years that I've been at the Hispanic Society, but it's really a treat to be able to work with not only the people, but also the rich museum and library collections that really allow us to combine these two areas on topics such as the one that we'll be exploring today. So I am going to share my slides. Just bear with me. And there we go. Excellent. So the Búcaros de Indias comprise of a diverse group of red and white or black earthenware produced in Tonalá, Mexico, Natán, Panama, and Santiago, Chile from the 16th through the 18th centuries. Pieces were largely made by hand or with the assistance of mold and then were burnished. They were dimpled, they were stamped, punched, incised, and often painted in elaborate, unusual forms and bold colors. And unlike the tin glazed earthenware from Puebla that I spoke about back in August, Búcaros were low fired, which makes them even more porous and fragile. As we look at where these art forms first originated, it becomes clear that they were born out of pre-Hispanic ceramic traditions that had developed long before the Spanish arrived. And it's likely because of their unusual qualities that they became so highly prized in Europe beginning in the 18th century. The term búcaro, however, comes from the Portuguese word púcaro, a type of ceramic burnished ware that dates back to the Etruscans and was produced in many parts of Europe, including Spain and Portugal. I should note that Portuguese burnished pottery was also made at this time, which is why the búcaros we always specified that they were from Las Indias or the Americas. And I think it's helpful in talking about the búcaros to go back to the definition of the term from the 1726 edition of the Diccionario de la Lengua Castellana. And that they define the búcaros as vase of fine and fragrant clay in which one makes water to drink and retains an agreeable and fragrant flavor. They are made of different heights and sizes. They come from Las Indias and are very highly esteemed and precious. These vessels were used for storing and drinking water, and it was believed actually that the vessels helped to purify water, which was often polluted. But they were also prized for their pleasant fragrance and were considered so pleasing that they became fashionable for people, particularly women, to consume small fragments of the pottery and rub pieces directly under their bare skin. It was actually believed to improve consuming these pieces or rubbing them on your skin would improve your complexion. In reality, as you can imagine, the consumption of these vessels on a regular basis resulted in the yellowing of skin, distension and hardening of the stomach, intestinal blockage, and reduced menstruation. Clearly, they were not good for you to eat. Búcaros de Indias are mentioned in a number of Golden Age literature, including Lope de Vega, Luis de Góngora, Tirso de Molina, Quevedo, Calderón de la Barca. However, the greatest source of information come from a collection of over 1,000 pieces that belong to the Counts of Oñate, now held by the Museo de América in Madrid, as well as the writings of a 17th century Florentine scientist and scholar, Lorenzo Magolote. The Florentine scholar and scientist Magolote was perhaps the greatest admirer of the Búcaro tradition, having spent years studying noble collections and forming a collection of his own. His obsession led him to exchange letters in 1695 with the Marchesa Ottavia Strozzi of Rome, who was another great admirer and collector of the ceramic ware. And I'm showing you on the left a handsome portrait of Magolote, and on the right, I'm showing an image from the Hispanic Society's rare books collection of a contemporary copy of the original letters by Magolote that is held at the Strozzi Library in Florence. In one of his letters, he articulates with great interest how best to safeguard these delicate pieces in special boxes. For Magolote, proper appreciation for the Búcaros was a process. He wrote, "The first thing I did was to perfume the small boxes, rubbing them over the course of 8 days with a sponge soaked in different floral waters, above all with thistle and carnations. Then I had them lined up with pearl-colored silk, since the color is most suitable to reflect the color of the type of clay used in these pieces. I placed the vessels in groups according to type, standing them straight up and burying them in the lower half of the treated cotton. Care was taken to let air flow freely among the vessels so that the cotton would absorb and retain the beneficial aroma emanating from them." Magolote describes 3 general types of búcaros. Those from Chile were considered the most charming, or graciosos. Those from Guadalajara as the most delicious, ricos, he calls them, and those from Natán as the most majestic. Unfortunately, very little is known about the pieces from Natán, other than the fact they were described as black pottery and often embellished with silver mounts. We know more, however, about the pieces from Chile, which according to Magolote were coveted for their bright red color, unusual forms, and elaborate decoration. A Jesuit Catalan priest who had just returned from Chile told Magolote that the búcaros from Chile were made by nuns of the Convent of Santiago, who, with exception to the hours reserved for prayer and the 40 days of Lent, worked from morning to night, making enough búcaros to fill 200 chests for shipment to Spain. There were likely more than one convent in Santiago involving the production of these vessels, although the most pieces seem to have come from the Poor Clare nuns at the Convento de las Clarisas in Santiago, which today is the site of the National Library of Chile. So the pair of altar lamps that I'm showing you here clearly derive from a silver form with a low base and exaggerated bosses. It's hard to see from this image, but the reticulated ovals that are set with glass, and here I'm kind of pointing to these ovals, and those are all set with glass, which would allow light from a candle inside to illuminate. In addition to the more common burnished pottery, the nuns also employed a distinct polychrome decoration on bright red ground that resembled Asian textile designs and gilded cloud forms known to have been common in Namban lacquer, which circulated in South America and became an important source of inspiration for a variety of art forms. Among the diverse utilitarian pieces were jars, canteens, or pilgrim bottles for cooling water, fountains, plates, bowls, incense burners, altar lamps, and even handles for forks and knives. The botija that I'm showing you on the right is in fact a known form to have been produced in Spain in the 15th and 16th centuries and used aboard ships in the New World. The tubular spout or pinton at one end was used to drink, while the flaring mouth, the boca, at the other side was used to pour liquid into the jug. Of the three types of búcaros, the burnished pottery of Tonalá, Mexico, was without doubt the most popular of all the Bouqueros de Indias, appearing most frequently in still life paintings. In the 17th century, Mexican búcaros were referred to as being from Guadalajara in western state of Jalisco. The colonial workshops, however, were mostly located in Tonalá, which sits just outside the city of Guadalajara. The Mexican historian Jose Antonio Alzate Ramirez offers one of the few early Mexican accounts of this pottery tradition in his 1752 article published in the Gaceta de Literatura. He describes the potters as indios, which suggests that the trade was dominated by artists of indigenous descent. Apparently, the city took pride in the fact that practically everyone in the household in Tonalá had its own, every household in Tonalá had its own workshop, and that men, women, and children alike were all involved in the production. An explanation of Magolote's assessment of Tonalá as the most aromatic and appetizing ware may be found in Alzate's findings that potters use the Mexican sapodilla plums, known as texcocotes or haws, or pieces of pine to extract the pleasing aroma of the clay. So they use this essence around the clay before they were shipped to Spain. This is a wonderful still life painting by Espinosa because it informs us that these vessels were shipped to Europe as early as 1624. And you can see, I'll just point to these types of pieces, and often they were actually set with different pieces of stone or other items. In addition to supporting dates, the paintings also help us understand that these vessels were prized possessions and served as token pieces of earth from the New World. Forms from Tonalá range from cups and bowls, jars, bottles, to elaborate multi-layered fountains with rings and other whimsical and extravagant shapes. The decoration is characterized by fluted walls, concentric rings, and dimples and embossed work. They're really fantastic. By the end of the 17th century, potters from Tonalá began to paint the vessels with polychrome floral designs over white and red ground. And this type of pottery that we see in the image on the, at the top were described as coloradas, colored. In addition to the abundance of small bowls that were made at the end of the 17th century, potters also produced these massive amphora forms, and these can size up to 4 feet in height. Magolote's letter reveals that collectors in Europe were particularly impressed by these large, ornate vessels, which became known as archibukuros. The large number of archibukuros in Europe suggests that they were made primarily for export and were displayed on these elaborate mounts in places of honor. In his letter, Magolote expresses his first impression of these pieces. I quote, "I cannot delay further to say a few words about archibukuros that just appeared in Florence, of the type I mentioned in my first letter. I will tell you that these are two barros of Guadalajara in the form of tinajas for oil, and with capacity for 6 or 7 barrels each. They are white and painted as usual, and perhaps more than usual with the brush of some red arabesques. You can already imagine that were not given to me, and you should know that they are in the galleries of the Room of Porcelain. And the example I'm showing you on the left is from the Hispanic Society with the double-headed eagle, often associated with the Habsburgs. And then we have a later example on the right from the Museo de America with much heavier decoration and gilded with relief work. And this, I should say, is one of 20 examples that came out of the Condesa de Oñati's collection, which I referred to earlier, today housed at the Museo de America. Also attributed to Tonalá are a small group of vessels made from the black micaceous clay. Blackware from Tonalá appears less frequently in contemporary literature, which suggests its rarity. It's mentioned by the Italian traveler Giovanni Francesco Gemelli Carreri in his travel accounts from 1700. He mentions that one was able to purchase fine vessels called bukari, including purple or black examples from Guadalajara. These wonderful figures of fish and a turkey are extremely rare and part of a group of pieces acquired by the Hispanic Society about a decade ago. In addition to their unique form, it's important to note that the group can be traced back to the collection of the Aldobrandini family of Florence. These figures also appear to be related to 2 bowls in the group with corresponding fish and bird inside of the cup. So here I'm showing you the same pieces. There's 2 pieces at the top are also shown from a different angle so that you can really see what appears on the inside. Of all the búcaros known, these cups probably best meet the desire of the upper class to consume water as part of a ritual of sorts, so that while they drank the coveted flavor of the water, one would also experience a visual and earthly delight. Whatever the original intent was, the condition of these vessels reveals that they were very well cared for and unlikely to have been used with any frequency, if at all. Among the most important collectors or collections of these wares were formed by the Florentine Great Duke Cosimo III, a member of the Medici family, the Florentine Marchesi Octavia Strozzi, the Queen Maria Luisa Le Lorenz, and the Sevillian Duchess of Alba. I should mention that several of the examples of archibukuros were known to emblazon the palaces, including the Royal Palace of Turin, the Quirinale Palace in Rome, the Agianori Palace of Florence, and Magolote's excitement for these was probably as a result of the arrival of the pair at the Grand Duke Cosimo III in 1693. Even among the great Habsburg collections today held at the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna are examples of búcaros. And here is in the palace galleries, a pair of very large vessels from Tonalá with these wonderful added silver mounts that were likely to have been made in Europe or applied in Europe. And I just want to thank, sort of quick shout out to my friend Henrietta for sharing this photo with me. Here's another jar from the Hispanic Society collection that was also recently acquired. It had been in a private collection in France. And what I find interesting about this piece is the addition of an 18th century French ormolu mount at the top and the base, added not so much as an embellishment, but also to repair a break, such that búcaros were far too special to be thrown out, even when they were damaged. The fascination for Bouquet de Indias was not limited to Europe alone. According to the 18th century Mexican historian Mateas de la Motte Padilla in his Historia de la Conquista de Provincias de la Nueva Galicia in 1742, Tonalá pottery was valued more than crystal, Chinese porcelain, and búcaros made from refined sugar paste, which is interesting, was known as alcorza. Motte de Padillas further reports that even the dust broken vessels from Tonalá was collected and sold in Jalapa, Veracruz, and Acapulco. The practice of consuming búcaros in Spain had become so widespread that it provoked a censure in 1696 as a penance. Priests were known to prohibit people from sampling them. And the French Countess d'Aulnoy, who traveled throughout Spain, recording her observations of Spanish high society, even took note in her travel accounts from 1679 of this peculiar fad, which people in Spain had become so accustomed. And I quote, "I had already told you that they have even a great passion for this earth, which frequently cause them in great obstruction. Their stomachs and their bellies will swell with it and become so hard as stone, and they themselves yellow as saffron. I mind to taste this ragout, which so much esteem beyond its worth, but I declare I'd rather eat a piece of stone." And I'll have one more. I have put this quote up on the screen for you to read for your enjoyment. The custom of perfuming and consuming búcaros in the Indias continued well into the 19th century in Spain. As late as 1840, the French writer and literary critic, Théophile Gautier, reported that people in Spain continued to enjoy these fragrant aromas, drinking the clay and even chewing shards and reducing them to powder. However, by the time of independence in Chile and in Mexico, the famed ware was no longer shipped to Spain. The production of búcaros in Guadalajara, Mexico, and Tonalá in particular is still very much alive today, largely in the same manner as it had been many centuries ago. In the last decade of the 19th century, there was only one nun named Sister Encarnación Joffre in Santiago who continued to produce the ceramic ware. But when she died in 1989, so too did the tradition. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, for the how shall I call it, a wonderful seminar on Búcaros, which is, of course, a form of pottery that most of us are not acquainted with. I have a number of questions for you. One of them is, I mean, it is fascinating, the thought that you would actually eat the container and not just the contents. But if that is so, you said they were unglazed. I would presume that if one could munch into them, they were also unfired?
So the pieces were fired and they could have been fired twice. Some of them may have only been fired once, but they were low fired. The firing was much lower than they were in places such as Puebla, where they were fired in a kiln, which was needed to produce that high, to produce the glaze that we see on Puebla pottery. But these pieces were low fired.
Well, you just mentioned the glaze. You showed a couple of pieces that were Chilean lamps, if I recall correctly. I found they were very shiny. Were they burnished? How did they achieve that?
So yes, so they were burnished. They were burnished with either a stone. In Tonalá, actually we know from Alzate, that they burnish the pottery with sometimes a dog or a wolf's tooth to produce that sort of glossy finish. And it took quite a bit of time and patience to burnish even a small piece of pottery like that. But particularly the large one, like we saw at the Kunsthistorische piece, must have been a real tour de force to burnish that size of a piece.
Margaret, speaking of tour de force, you showed a photograph of a very elaborate búcaro in the Kunsthistorisches that obviously was very big, and it had mounts in ormolu. If it's low fired, how on earth can something so big survive unbroken?
So I think it's a great question, and that And certainly a lot of pieces did break, and as a result, those were probably likely the pieces that were consumed. So I do think there was quite a bit of breakage, making them even more valuable. But one of the reasons why I showed that piece with the ormolu mounts is that clearly had been broken. And it wasn't uncommon in Spain when a piece of lusterware, let's say, was broken, that they would, to do the repair, they would add an ormolu mount. It would embellish it. It was also fashionable, and it would also hide the repair. So that's sort of a key to that. But they were so important as collector items that they would not throw them away, even if they were broken.
Well, some of them you said were, if I noted here, more than 4 feet high. Could they have actually been made in pieces and put together?
So those were clearly the form itself were made in pieces and then put together. But once they had to have been fired, it had to have been fired altogether.
Uh-huh. My last question before I allow our audience to ask theirs has to do with their appearance in Europe. We're talking about a humble material. We're talking about clay, things from far away from the Americas. What is the trigger, if there is one, that causes these pieces to be imported and to be assigned so much value, to the point that in the still life you showed, they are present in front of expensive gilt silver plates? What explains that?
So I think it's an interesting question. I mean, we know that very little, some of the glazed ware from Puebla was shipped to Europe, but certainly not nearly in the numbers of the búcaros, the unglazed pieces. And I would say that they were really so highly esteemed because they were so unusual. And I think it also was a piece of the earth. It was a piece of the new world that everybody was so curious about. And they certainly appeared in cabinets of curiosity, but it is kind of part of that culture, sort of having a piece of this other world that everyone was so curious about.
Very, very good answer. Christina Aldrich, do you have any questions from our audience to sort of promote?
Yes, thank you both again for a wonderful presentation. We have a question that came in via email asking about the double-headed eagle on the Hispanic Society's Búcaro. You mentioned that this was a Habsburg image, and do you know of any other examples of a royal coat of arms that appear on Búcaros?
So I'm just trying to think if there are there may be, but I think the Habsburg coat of arms is interesting because it became such an important emblem that went beyond just sort of symbolizing the Habsburgs. Even after the end of the Habsburg Empire, you continue to see the double-headed eagle really as kind of a motif throughout the colonial world. There may be one or two, but it's very extremely rare. Some of the larger pieces, I'm just trying to think, I don't recall a coat of arms, but there are certainly rampant lions that recall coats of arms, but maybe not a specific coat of arms.
Wonderful, thank you. We have another question from a member asking about the spouted jar or botijo and the footed dish from Santiago. They were wondering what that footed dish with the hole in the center, what was the use of that type of ceramic?
So actually, if you want, I'm going to share my screen and go back to it. Oh, you see, let's see, I'll go back to, we'll go back to that. Here we go. Just bear with me, current slide. Okay. don't know why it doesn't want to. Anyway, the piece on the left, and I'm glad you raised it. I didn't have a chance to really talk about it. I think it's probably an incense burner of some sort, given the depression on the inside. It reminds me of a salver, which is a form you see in Europe, but because of that indentation in the middle, I think it was intended to hold something. So perhaps something like incense, but I can't say for sure. Does that answer the question? I think that.
Yes, thank you. And we have another really interesting question from
Sure.
a member asking, have you ever drunk any water from a búcaro? And if so, how did it taste?
Oh, geez. I've never, well, it wouldn't be appropriate. I think Philippe would be appalled if I added water to any of these dishes to sort of experience for myself. So no, I haven't tasted water, but I certainly have smelled them and taken great pleasure kind of trying to see what is the appeal. Granted, we have a long time since these were made, and even if they were, a zapadilla, ointment was added to it. But I wanted to point out to this beaker, and for some reason it won't let me. Do you see my screen, Christina? I just want to make sure.
Yes, we can see it.
And we always photograph pieces from their best view, just like, all of us, we want to have our best view. But this piece actually has a break that looks just like a bite mark. And I always like to point it out when I show it to visitors, because, you wonder, is somebody looking at it and say, oh, this looks so delicious, I'm going to take a bite. But no, so the answer is no, I have never tasted the water, but I certainly have smelled, and it smells very earthy. Anyone who has handled any kind of low-fired earthenware will know that it has this very nice kind of earthy smell to them coming from the clay.
Great, thank you. And another question is, are there good collections of búcaros here in New York or in the US, perhaps outside of the museum world? Any private collections that you know of?
I actually don't know of any private collections. My colleagues at other museums are been very intent on filling their, complementing their collections of Spanish viceregal art with pieces of decorative art, such as the Búcaro tradition. And my colleague at the Metropolitan Museum, Rhonda Castle, made a really spectacular acquisition a couple of years ago of two very large pieces from Tonalá from the late 17th century. And I believe they're in the gallery. But in terms of private collections, I am not aware of any private collections. They're actually quite rare to find on the market. So it would be hard for someone to form a sizable collection, but there's certainly possible if someone, has a piece that they found, but I'm not aware of any large collections in the US.
If I may ask my own question at this point, another one. When you speak about acquisitions, I noticed that a couple of times you said that the piece you were showing was a recent acquisition of the Hispanic societies. In the time of Huntington, were any búcaros, did any enter the collection, or is it all a fairly recent phenomenon?
I'm glad you asked that question, Philippe, because there was one piece when I first started to work at the Hispanic Society that was attributed as non-Hispanic. It was a sort of a category that we've maintained. And it was actually believed to be Native American. We then realized after visiting the collection at the Museo America that our piece is quite similar to their pieces. It's a small cup with a handle, and unfortunately I didn't have a photograph to show you today. But aside from that piece, we had that one piece, all the other pieces, and today we have about 15 pieces. Those were all acquired in the past 10 to 15 years, which is, I'm quite proud of that. We've really worked hard to build that collection. I think it's an important part of the history.
Well, congratulations on that, Margaret. Before I bring the program to a close, Christina, I don't want to cut off any of our members. Was there any other question?
There's just one final question, and it's a clarifying question. It seemed like perhaps one of the images showed a búcaro from the Museo de América in Madrid, the amphora from Tonalá, that looked perhaps like it was gilded. Is that object gilded? Was that typical of some of these búcaros? Would they be gilded?
Yes, so they were gilded, some of them were, and particularly of that, there was a group of the archibukuros, the large amphora forms that were very heavily gilded and polychrome with all sorts of ornate decoration. So that was not uncommon. Sometimes we question whether that was added later, but that I think appears to be original to the period. I will say there's another piece that we have that I showed earlier. Actually, let me see if I can go back to it. It's this one. This piece on the right also has some gilding, which has now been lost, unfortunately, but that piece was also gilded. And another aspect of this piece I find fascinating is that scholars, and particularly anthropologists, often talk about how this tradition really shows the continuation of a pre-Hispanic tradition, and that they used tools and instruments that had predated the Spanish arrival. But this is an exception. This piece, if you look at it closely, was wheel thrown. So there certainly were moments when and times where a potter had access to the potter's wheel, and used it to make this piece. But this piece, I just wanted to say, was gilded, and they were, unfortunately, the way they did the gilding, it did not always, with time and probably with just the touching them, wore off with time.
Well, this has been absolutely riveting, Margaret. And as I thank you, I'd like to say, as chairman, that I give you permission to put a little water in one of them. Don't take a bite out of it. That would be better if you didn't do that. So thank you. Thank you to all of the members who were with us tonight, and for your very good questions. We are thrilled our community and supporters continue to stay involved with the museum, despite our inability, obviously, to join in person. A reminder, our next Tertulia will take place on Tuesday, October 20th at 5 p.m. And we will be joined by Professor Mark Aldrich. The topic is going to be a little bit different, shall we say, as we will be looking at cookbooks from our collection, and the talk will include a tutorial, so be ready, on making the classic rice dish of paella. So thank you all, and until October 20th. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Philippe. Have a good night.